Hey everybody. So for today's video, I want to talk about how you can recycle or reclaim from home. I know a lot of us are working in our own kitchen or small spaces and we're working with a small amount of clay at a time, typically not having the same resources that we do in our community studio to have like a plaster board or a larger recycle system. So today I'm going to talk about how you can reclaim your clay at home in small batches with minimal mess and how to approach clay when it's dry and when it's wet. So the things that you'll need are two different buckets. So the way that I've been sorting out things and trying to make sure that I don't put any clay down the sink is I have a plastic bucket here that I put all of my slop water into. So I have a jar that I use on my wheel that about once a week I dump the whole jar into the bucket. I let that water settle out, so you'll have kind of clear water at the top, and then you can pour that layer out, give it another day or so to set, and it should be this kind of general like wet slop, but still a little bit more chunky. You might notice a little bit of discoloration depending on the clay that you're using. That's usually like a little bit of mold and bacteria that builds up, so it is better to cycle through that clay sooner rather than later. It won't damage your work or make the clay toxic, but it is something that you want to be mindful of because it might not be good for you, especially if you're working with a small space. For me, it's more, I'm a little bit concerned because it just like gets a little stinky and I don't like the smell. You'll want another bucket where you're gonna have your dry scraps. So in this, I will take like all of my larger chunk pieces and I'm gonna break them down into a size that is like no bigger than this, so like kind of like generally nickel size. So all of these larger pieces, I just will kind of manually go in and crunch them up. When you're working with the dry clay, you want to make sure that it is completely bone dry. The main mistake that people make when they're trying to reclaim their clay is that you're often trying to work with like leather hard clay and rehydrating it, and it's just going to make it a lot clumpier and a lot harder to re-wedge and work back in. So either collect it kind of in the slop jar that's like all wet, or keep it dry and let it be totally bone dry. When it's totally bone dry and it's all broken up, then you'll add water to it, a little less than or exactly even to the height of those clay scraps, and I usually let that set for a whole day. That will help all of the clay particles really absolve and absorb so that they're not going to be like large chunks of wet clay that won't slop onto there. The next step that you're going to do is once you've waited that full day and we have it like that consistency that I showed you with the wet slop, I like to take like a baking tin so that it's contained. I have seen people do it directly on their table, but because I have such a small space and I share my space with my partner, I like doing it in a baking tin because I can do this all on the table, make a little mess, clean it up, and then set this in a spot underneath my wheel so that it's out of the way and I don't have to worry about claiming the table space for a long period of time. I put down a bag of, like a garbage bag that I cut in half. And then you'll want a thicker fabric. Something that has like a tight weave to it is ideal. A lot of people use canvas. I just don't have that on hand. So I'm using a cut up scrap of my partner's old pants, but they do have like a very tight knit to them. You're gonna wanna have a long enough cloth that you can fold it in half, and I'll show you why later. You also want a clean bucket of water so you can clean up easily, and then a sponge, and I just have like a towel to dab off kind of in between. From here, once your canvas is in your baking tin, that will help contain the slop. You'll use your bucket and just kind of scoop it out. If you do have any larger clumps and chunks, just use your hand to work out those. It will help you later so you feel like you're doing less wedging just to kind of compensate for that. So the reason that we use the cloth is that it's going to absorb some of that water from the bottom, and then the top with just normal airflow is going to dry that out a little bit more evenly. If you just try to kind of slop this onto something that's not absorbent, it will take a lot more time to dry and that surface won't be readily available. You'll want to smooth it out evenly too. The thicker that the clay is, the less or the more that you'll have to wait. So you don't want it super thin, but I've been kind of aiming for like a centimeter thick. And I'm just scooping up that and trying to keep it as close to this edge so I make minimal mess. Now that it's all slopped on there, I'm going to use my hand to just move it across to make it even. If I feel any like major clumps, like this is all one wad, I can just kind of like break that up with my fingers, smush it back down, and kind of slide things around. It will be a little lumpy. That's fine because you're going to wedge and wedge that later. But I just find as long as it's even, it will make that easier. Now that I have all this goo on my hand, I'm going to kind of squeeze that out a few times on top to make sure that I'm using minimal clay in that water because I don't want to waste that. And then I have my water here to clean my hands and my sponge. This water that I have in a small bucket now is just going to go back into my jar that I throw from in my wheel. So that way it's a closed system and I'm not putting this clay water down my sink. If you are somebody who is just hand building from home, I would recommend using, like pouring this extra water into maybe like a Tupperware or an old yogurt container that you can use to be your consistent water cup. That way you're not each time having to manage clay water. So this will then just go back, and then as I'm throwing, I'll start that system over. So it's a closed loop and there's no major water going out. I just used my towel here to dab, but my hands should be totally clean. Like I don't need to wash them in the sink with that remainder of stuff. I got that all off in the water there. So now that this is all slopped on there, should be relatively even. The reason that I have the 2 layers is I usually let this set about a day and a half to 2 days, depending on the climate in your house. If you want to fast track that, you can set it next to like a baseboard, you know, within reason. Don't put it right underneath it because this is fabric. You can put it within 6 inches of that, or any area that's like by a radiator that might be a little bit drier instead of like your garage. So kind of keep in mind which are the drier spots in your house, and that will help it dry faster. Once you're on that like day 1 or day 2, I use the bottom here, so I'm going to kind of fold this up and take out this part so that I can just flip it onto this other side. have it set out for another half day, and then it's like the most magical consistency. So that's a personal preference. If you wanted to just wait 2 to 3 days, it probably would be fine to wedge and reuse again. But I just like having the flip because it's a little bit more consistent. And then from there, I find a dry spot on here to wedge that up, or on a table with another piece of scrap fabric. So I hope this is helpful. I would recommend doing this in small batches, so not letting the clay pile up. It's a lot easier to kind of let the bucket get half full, or whatever container that you're using, and then doing like about a baking sheet at a time. If you really pile it up, it's going to feel more daunting. You will feel like you're going to run out of clay, and it's just helpful because it won't create as much of a stink or molding situation. So I recommend, as we're staying at home, trying to be on top of your reclaiming system, especially if you have limited space and you don't have your whole studio set up at home. So I hope this is helpful. And if you have any questions about reclaiming or recycling, just make sure if you are mixing clay that you're gonna mix clay that fires to the same temperature. Do not mix clay that has different temperatures fired to it. But feel free to comment in the post if you have any questions about reclaiming and how to store or manage your own clay as you're working from home. So I hope this is helpful, as we've done some projects so far and people might be not sure how to approach those little scraps and things that they're hanging on to.